All right, we were in the standard model of human memory. This is the model that if you were to take a cognitive psychologist, strap them to a chair, force them to tell you what they really think is going on in memory, this is probably what they would say. This is the accepted model, more or less, and then everybody will try to move it around a little bit and add to it. But this is what they really think is going on. Let me throw these additional arrows up here, because this is where we were. So most psychologists would say that you have to hold that initial sensory information someplace, and the someplace for them is going to turn out to be in a sensory register for each and every different sensory system you have. So there's one for vision. Well, but there would also be one for touch, and there'd be one for audition, and so on and so forth. And they're not the same thing. They're each separate, one from another. Okay, so you could sort of, I should maybe have another little breakout slide here, breakout box here, which says one per sensory system. Okay, so that would be true for, so a little bit odd, right? For things like your digestive system would have a sensory register, maybe too. But that aside, so this is a place, and we'll talk about its details in a little bit more in just a second. Then you're not very much aware of this. This feels to you like kind of the flow of information from reality. It then gets into this thing, which we're going to temporarily call short-term memory. And then I'm going to give you just a little bit of a modern update on it, working memory. So short-term memory holds things, and when it's in short-term memory, more or less consciously aware of. So this is that kind of feeling that you have where it's like, oh, that is the stuff that I know right now, not the stuff that is on the tip of my tongue, but the stuff that I actually have conscious awareness of. So for example, you're hearing the sound of my voice, and you just have awareness of those last few sounds, and they kind of fade away, and that's all in short-term memory. Right? And now for a few moments you have access to the exact words, and then maybe the meanings, and then maybe nothing at all. Right? So that's short-term memory, and we'll say more about that. And then we also have a third store, which we're calling long-term memory. And often when we talk about memory, this is what we're talking about. Do you remember something from way back? Well, that would be going into long-term memory and accessing it. Okay, so short-term memory holds a very small amount of information. It's kind of like the RAM in your computer, that hot memory where the computer can get to that information instantly. That's, okay? It only lasts, unless you do something active, it only lasts a very short order. Maybe 20 to 30 seconds is okay. It kind of depends on modality, it turns out, auditory versus visual. And it famously has limited capacity. That means it can only hold so many things at once. Well, what's a thing? Question. Well, what they wanted it to be was, in analogy to computing, they wanted it to be bits of information. You don't really do bits. You're not a 0-1 type of system. So it turns out that bits depends on how you have grouped things together, the information in the environment together into informational units. So if that makes you just go, what? You're not alone, because a lot of psychologists went, what are you talking about? So there is this thing, and it's a weird phenomenon where if you put things together into an informational unit that's sensible to you, you can remember it better than if you try to remember the individual bits alone, individual items alone. Talk about that in a little bit. It's weird. So that's short-term memory. Some properties of long-term memory. This can be in the long-term memory of, well, all the stuff that you remember for a long time. Things like facts, but also like images, your thoughts, maybe, your feelings, things that are not so much unitized like that, but are skills, or would also be in long-term memory. So you are very skilled at lots and lots of things. Some things that you appreciate, some things that you probably do so easily that you don't appreciate them at all. So you're very skilled, maybe by now, at driving, right? You get in the car, you don't have to do a lot of thinking about it, but it's a skill that you've acquired over hours of driving. You're skilled at writing, something you learned how to do. And this theory would have it that all those skills are residing somehow in long-term memory. When you need them, you get them out and they run the show for you, right? You just sort of say, I want to write now. And somehow the writing skills come to the front. They go, oh yeah, here we go. Very good. Yes.
That's associated with like muscle memory.
So things like muscle memory, it would all be in long-term memory. Yes, we call muscle memory, we tend to call it procedural memory. Because it just covers a little bit more ground. But yes, so the term muscle memory is in use in athletics in particular. Right? So now things get even weirder. Well, how long do these things last? Well, it turns out that in long-term memory, things last a really, really long time. And in fact, they seem to last until something interferes with their stability, like something else gets in the way of your getting to it. But it doesn't seem to be the case that, at least during human lifetime, of course, don't live forever. At least during your human lifetime, you actually lose memory per se, as long as, barring disease and injury. Right? So let me put it a different way. There's no like time course for a memory to be dissolved. It's just there until something bad happens to it. The bad thing could, of course, be disease or injury. It could also be something interferes with your ability to access it. But even when that happens, you still could, in theory, get to it. Right? So you have these kind of endless, temporally speaking, traces, they call them, things that are lasting and are your memories and that you can always get to. Weird, right? Seemingly impossible. And worse yet, your long-term memory seems to have unlimited capacity. So your brain does not actually get full, even though it may feel full. Sometimes you get tired, but your brain itself, it doesn't seem to be like a space issue like there would be in your computer, right? You keep putting memories into your computer in the form of files, and eventually your computer says, yeah, that's all very nice if you want me to see another one, but I ain't got no more room for any of those files. Right? But your brain doesn't like that. Your brain just keeps and remember. Now they can start to interfere with each other. That's a different thing. Right? At least in this conception, okay? How they're thinking. When you want things out of long-term memory, you have to retrieve them back into short-term memory, generally speaking, to know that they're there. Right? So I was just trying to, I was just trying to remember the name of the guys, so I feel bad I didn't credit these people who came up with this scheme. Well, life of me, I can't come up with it. It's there in my long-term memory. I know these people. That did before. Very well. They're much older than I am. I'm like, just can't come up with their names, right? Yeah. Didn't occur to me that was ironic until just now, right? So they're there, they're there. It is. Well, anyway, doesn't matter for your purposes. This. Wouldn't it be nice to do something that's so standard that people are like, your model is the standard model, right? They don't get catered to names. So this is, as I said, the standard model. The place where people are focused mostly are in short-term memory and long-term memory. And we'll spend most of our time there. But I want to give a little bit of respect to the sensory registers because they're very interesting as well. And people have done some clever things trying to get at the sensory registers. I think they're kind of fascinating because it's the idea that you have this memory system that's sitting between you and the world. I find that a little bit fascinating. Right? It's like, how could there be I need to remember the world? Do I really? Well, maybe. So let me show you just very quickly, some of the evidence for the sensory registers. Particularly we'll do vision because it's the easiest one to do in here. So again, we're holding sensory information, very, very well organized, just kind of raw data almost. That's a little too strong. It's kind of organized by the perceptual system, but not connected to all the meanings yet. So it hasn't sort of locked into you. It's just like kind of a little bit of slightly processed information about the world, okay? You can hold that sensory information in memory for a brief moment after the stimulus has disappeared. And that's sort of where people started to press with data research. Okay, so there, it's very, probably a little too long for this kind of presentation. Usually it's a little bit more boom. Okay, but that's what we got. So it'll be okay. Back, we'll do it again. Okay, so you can see this thing's gonna, if you look at the screen, you'll see this thing is gonna pop up. Okay, so of course, you know, this being psychology, do something. The thing that we want you to do is recall all those items. Oh, that's pretty hard. There are too many items, right? There are a lot of items to attend to, but they were there just very, very briefly in your sensory register. So people thought that was kind of interesting. And you could typically recall about 4 or 5 of these. Right? So they're looking for the characteristics of these sensory systems. So they're saying, well, your visual sensory system, given particular conditions, is about 4 or 5 letters. Right? Well, okay, that's pretty interesting. Okay, so again, 4 or 5 letters. What people do is they start to manipulate the time delay between the displaying of the letters and the recall. Okay, so they make it shorter and shorter, longer and longer. Okay, so the longer the delay, the fewer the letters recalled. Okay, so if I present, turn it off, and then let it fade and fade and fade and fade, then the fewer the letters are recalled. So the idea being that these things aren't making it through to the short-term system, they're very rapidly fading. So that's what they're trying to understand is like, what's the temporal dynamic of this thing going from present to not present anymore for each letter. See what I'm saying? So that's what they're interested in, and they get this rapid decay after a second. And along comes this very clever guy named George Sperling, and he develops, I can remember something, he develops this thing called a partial report technique, which is, I bring it up because it's kind of interesting and cool, but also shows you like kind of some of the mysteries of these things, right? Of your abilities with this sensory register. So what he does is he asks you to recall just one row of this kind of display. Okay, we got a 4x4 grid, and essentially he says, recall this row, but don't worry about the others. But you don't know which row until after the display is turned off. Okay, it's kind of clever. So the idea, what he's trying to argue, is that all that information is there and available, and that the fading of it occurs with a particular time, but the whole thing is fading. Okay, so it's there, the whole thing is fading. If I point to something within it, you'll see how that happens in a second. Even though it's just in your memory, you can report that stuff out as it fades, just before it goes away. Right, so he's trying to make an argument about the whole contents, as opposed to the other situation being that maybe there are just a few of them hanging around, and those are the ones you report. Right, a few of the 16 are available. So it kind of looks like this. Okay, so now the idea is that you report that line. Yeah, no, go down. It's a little bit cheating because you already know which line I want you to report, but maybe you'll get the feeling for it. Right, and so that what he finds is that you can actually control your attention within the sensory register, and you can put your attention on the line that's pointed to and report it out. So the argument is that whole array is available in the sensory register. It's the whole thing that's fading, and that you can actually control what it is that you attend to within it. So he makes this argument that performance is equal to free recall. And again, the point is that all of them are registered. All the items are in memory. And the way he proves that is he points to different ones. Right? And they all can be reported. It's just that you can't get them all out before they fade. Right? Because the visual image is fading from that sensory register in this case. So he wants to argue that this memory trace that you have is like really accurate. It contains the information. It's just that it's often fading faster than you could possibly report it. Because that's kind of not its job, right? You don't usually just have things in sensory register and report them. Usually you move them into short-term memory in this model, and then you do stuff, right? Because you attend to certain things and not others. The things you attend to get into short-term memory, then you work on it. So Sperling's point is that the sensory register probably has huge amounts of information in it. It fades very, very quickly, but you can choose things from it very effectively. Okay, so it's kind of a funny memory store, because usually we think about memory as holding things for a long time, right? But this one is like super short memory buffer. Okay, so people have done some work in this, but you can see already this is a hard place to work, right? You're talking about things that don't last more than like a second and a little bit. Very, I would not recommend this for your dissertation research. You'd be like, you're running around trying to find something that fades after a single second. Yeah, we'll leave this one alone. So that's what people did. They're like, yeah, that's nice. Good job, George. And then they said, let's do something more easy. So the more easy thing, sort of the low hanging fruit, is short-term memory. So why is it low hanging fruit? Well, because it only holds 7 plus or minus 2 items. So that's nice. You're not going to get out huge lists of items, right? So we already sort of know that. You are used to reporting this information, and it is the stuff that is in the sort of that conscious area of your mind. So that also is super convenient if you are trying to work on it. So it has this very, very limited capacity, which is kind of strange. It might be convenient if you, as a human, could work on, I don't know, 50 things all at once, right? You got this going on, you're aware of it. You got another 30 things going on over here, right? But it just doesn't work that way. So for whatever reason, the system was not designed for that. So you have this very limited capacity, which this is a famous catchphrase in psychology, 7 plus or minus 2. There's a famous paper by a guy named George Miller. 7 plus or minus 2, meaning 5 to 9. You could have just said 5 to 9 bits of information. And 20 to 30 seconds before it decays, something like that. I'm not sure it's always that long, but something like that. So as an example, let's say you're given a string of numbers. This one is in the middle here, right? So we have 7 numbers. And you're asked to remember these. Like someone gives you a phone number. Say, yeah, we'll go, call this number. They rattle off a number and call it. And then they hang up. Because this number is important, maybe. So you've got the number. It's now in short-term memory. You have put your attention on it. You've moved it into short-term memory. You are consciously aware of it, but you have just seconds before something else happens. And the something else is going to start to decay. And so I've kind of depicted decay to be this, right? So what a nice and strong. Now I'm not saying this is like this imagery is actually real or anything, but functionally it's kind of like you have this really strong representation of the numbers that slowly starts to go. And that's, you know, a phenomenon that everybody's familiar with. If you then repeat those numbers to yourself, it's almost like ringing bells or something, right? Where you ring a bell or you spin a plate. That's another thing people say. You ring a bell and it vibrates for a while and then it slowly gets silenced. So it's that kind of phenomenon where you go through and you ring the bell, don't ring the 7 bell, go 7. Right, so it does it for a while. But you can only go so fast through the list. And by the time you get to the end of the list, the front of the list is starting to go, right? So it's like, oh, you guys don't know. So there's like a whole comedy routine, spinning plates like that. Maybe, I don't know. So worst thing that can happen, of course, is that somebody starts with some other numbers while you're trying to get these numbers up. There are some other numbers for whatever reason, radio's on, or your friend starts saying something and it also consists of numbers. Now you've got numbers, and maybe the first few of these those slots get overwritten with these new numbers. Okay, so that's a very common phenomenon. So you get the sense, and I hope it probably squares with your, with the usual phenomenology that you have in short-term memory. So, a little bit more formally, rehearsal, that process of running through and ringing the bells, right? Going 7, 6, 3, 8, 2, 7. Right. That slows the fading temporarily. Another way to say it is sort of re-injects vibration, whatever you want to call it, bringing the activation of that meaningful unit back up. Okay. So we sometimes call this maintenance rehearsal. So we maintain the activation of those things in memory through maintenance rehearsal. Over and over again. That maintenance rehearsal, as it turns out, also increases the probability of jumping these guys into long-term memory. So there are kind of two things going on. One is you keep it active in short-term memory, and the other is that you maybe jump it into long-term memory, which is actually probably where you really want it in my phone number scenario. Right? You can also do things like elaborative rehearsal, where you're simply thinking about the information and maybe making connections to other things that you know during rehearsal. Okay, so maybe you are a distance runner or something. There's actually a famous case of a distance runner who was completely ruining someone's experiments like this because they kept turning all the numbers into times, like running times, right? So they're like, oh, 7.63. Well, that would be a really good, I don't know what that is. It's too fast or 100 meters. It'd be like really good 80-meter time, 8.8, and so on. So you can imagine it, right? So there are all sorts of distances that you might have run where these times would make sense, right? And so this person was pretty smart, and they kept doing this. People, what are you doing? You have 7 plus or minus 2 of these things, and they could remember very, very long lists accurately doing this kind of procedure, right? And then eventually the researchers like, what's going on? And they're like, well, I'm doing this thing. What they're doing was this kind of elaborative rehearsal where they're connecting the information they already knew. Okay. So you can see it's not like a hard limit on the system. It's like you can game it. And the gaming of it actually reveals things about how it works. Yeah.
So when he grouped those numbers into runtimes, could he only remember 7 plus or minus?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, right. So the very good question is, hold on now. If you're really playing this game, right, he should only be able to do that up to 7 plus or minus 2 groupings, right? And that is indeed the idea, right? But he was able to do more than that somehow. And so how he was able to organize it above and beyond this implied limit, right? He should have had just 7 plus or minus 2 times available to him. But somehow he was able to do more than that. So yeah, it's a good question. Right. So, all right, everybody okay so far? Right. I feel like this is you know, things you sort of know implicitly, like, oh, you guys have a name for that. Oh, we have another name for that. Right? And they do. But then, as you're pointing out, some of it doesn't go all the way through, right? They're a little fake. So you'll see they've tried to fix it. I don't know that it's been very much fixed. All right, so this went on for a while. Short-term memory as this kind of player in the center. And you can maybe get the feeling already like, hold on now. You have this thing named as a memory store, and yet you want it to contain consciousness? It's just a memory store? It seems like you're burying the lead, right? Like if it is your conscious ability to work with everything that is information in the world, and the remarkable things that you think it's doing are holding 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information, isn't like all the other stuff it does, isn't that interesting? Like putting things together, reasoning, and so on and so forth. Where's that all live? So they tried to revamp this model into where the central player, what we were calling short-term memory a second ago, gets recast as something called working memory. Okay. So when I say the standard model has evolved, that's what I mean. People have tried to say, well, you know, seems like there's more going on here. Let's try to make some other theoretical constructs that are going to sit inside of the guy in the middle. What was short-term memory is now going to become working memory. This is all due to a group led by Alan Badley and Grant Hitch. Don't worry about those names, but I remember some people's names, so I'm going to. And so this idea is their idea. They've tried to elaborate it to fix some of these shortcomings. So their argument is that this isn't just about memory. There are a lot of things going on, and those things matter for memory, but they also matter for cognition more generally. So this is working memory. So working memory is going to have a bunch of kind of new functional components to it, where in the standard model, short-term memory kind of had those things by accident, right? It was mostly a memory store, and then it turned out that you had miraculously the ability to do stuff in there, but unexplained, right? So you can suddenly do rehearsal. Well, who's doing rehearsal? Where's that coming from? So what Badley and Hitch are going to do is they're going to essentially create some components that are supposed to be run in the system, okay? So again, it's going to be this temporary storage, but now we're also kind of equally emphasizing processing. And now we can use it for things. It's involved in things like solving problems, goal-directed behavior, finding out about the world. Right? So it's become more in touch with problems other than wordless learning, which seems like a step forward. So they're proposing this conscious workspace, which is, you don't find a lot of psychologists who are willing to use the C word, consciousness. Very, very tricky. Makes people itch. Cannot explain that. Cannot explain it. No idea what that is. But you seem to have it, and I seem to have it. So let's agree not to talk about it anymore. So conscious workspace is going to be at the center of this, okay? Which includes storage capacity and processing capacity. Thereafter, not only can you store things in a limited way, but you can process things in a limited way. All right, so we're still going to maintain this limited capacity, and we're going to presumably what's going to happen is this model is just going to take over the other. It's going to kind of gobble it up. So yeah, I got you. Yeah, I got all your phenomena there due to this. So that's the goal. So here are the components that Baddeley and Hitch are trying to push. One, and I'm not kidding, is called the Visual Spatial Sketchpad. So you're supposed to have a visual spatial component that allows you to do storage and reasoning about spatial relations, about things in your imagery and that sort of thing. So if I wanted to remember this room, it would be a visual representation of this room is the idea. And then I could do things like, oh, well, what's the most efficient way to reach that back door? Well, I have to, if I weren't seeing it at the moment, I have to close my eyes to not see it, right? And I can be like, well, okay, in my memory, there's sort of two equally good ways to go. I could go this way, I could go that way, right? Up those stairs or those stairs, but going up these stairs, that's not very efficient. Right, so I'm able to solve problems. So it's kind of like having a separate and special place to store things in the same way that short-term memory would have. So not very much different. But you can also like reason in here in a visual kind of domain. Then you have this same kind of system, sort of, maybe a little bit more limited, for auditory things. They call this the phonological loop, and it stores verbal information temporarily. And you can see that one of the reasons they wanted this, because they had all this work on word learning, or word memory, I should say, memory for words, or nonsense items, or whatever, right? So, but usually auditorially presented. And then you put that in the phonological loop. So you hear or read aloud some words, put them in the phonological loop. The phonological loop is essentially that thing that rings the bells over and over again. Okay. And you control that within working memory, and you explicitly control that. Right. So it's part of the model. And then the other kind of major player, they've tweaked this a little bit over the years, is this thing that a lot of power, and I'm sure it's a very good theoretical idea, but they call it the central executive. Okay, so we have these two component systems that can be used. Then we have a central executive that controls things like rehearsal in the phonological loop, but also be in the visual spatial sketchpad. Reasoning, it just does reasoning. Attention, decision making about how to distribute resources to tasks. Knows an awful lot of the central executive I'm worried about it. And also what you get encoded and what you get retrieved for long-term memory. So it's like a little super smart homunculus that knows a lot about how the system works and is able to go and get the information it needs. Oh, it would be convenient now for me to know the rules of addition. Addition, how to do that, procedural stuff that goes in there, yeah. Good, now I can do my addition. So it just seems to know an awful lot. I'm not sure. At some point, it seems like I thought we were trying to explain that guy. But somehow this guy now has arrived as the central executive. At any rate, I should be selling, not criticizing. So this is the central executive. Boy, it's great. It controls these things. And it does a lot of other fancy stuff, like reasoning. So that's the general idea. We haven't said much about attention, and I'm just going to bring up attention as one of these, almost like a partner with consciousness. There are people who study attention, but boy, it is some funky stuff. Because it kind of presupposes consciousness in a way. But attention is clearly important. So what's with the pennies? Well, you've probably seen pennies before. We still do have, solid coin. not as much as we used to. You know, it used to be before we paid with credit cards for everything. Everybody carried cash, and pennies were one of those things you had sometimes. But even though, at least back in the day, you used to have tremendous exposure to coins, right, it would be pretty hard to pick out which one of these was consistent with your experience. See what I mean? Only one of these is actually like a legal penny. All the others have things in the wrong place, or Abe is facing the wrong way, or something like that. And so what's the point? Well, the point is, despite massive exposure to something, you don't necessarily pay attention to the details unless they are important. See what I mean? So the somewhat underselling point here is that here, who cares what the penny? It's a penny, right? But if you see 1,000 of them, you might expect that you would be able to pick out the one that is the right one immediately. But it turns out you never put your attention there, so it didn't get into long-term memory. Let me give you just a little tour of working memory and how these guys are thinking about this system. Yeah, so this is a fair thing to say. So it's just like short-term memory is supposed to be, in that it's this kind of crucial meeting point between the sensory information you're taking in and long-term memory. So that stuff is converging there. And you're trying to figure out what to do with that sensory information, given everything you know. Right? So that's nice. Seems like important stuff. It's going to have both bottom-up and top-down processing. So it is both driven by the knowledge you have, that's top-down, and driven by what's going on in your sensory world. There are going to be all these as part of the bottom. I'm going to try that all over. I'm just going to start from the beginning. As part of the top-downness, we're going to have prior knowledge affecting performance. And here, the idea of you using strategies to help expand working memory's abilities makes a lot of sense because you have the central executive built into the theory. Okay. So the flow goes a little bit like this. So you're going to get things in, and this will be out here is the environment. Okay, it's not labeled, but these arrows are giving information in and allowing you to put stuff out too. Like, I'm going to say something. Send that to the sayer, whatever the sayer is, right? So there's a part of the brain that's the sayer. You know, say, direct my arm to do such and so. Send that to the motor system, right? It's that kind of componenty system. The central executive is sending things sometimes to the visual spatial sketchpad, right? So here's a page of text. And now as a central executive, you are able to give orders, right? And then put your attention here. Okay? You're then able to take this information, and if you want to, put it into the auditory system here, right? Which mostly just keeps it alive. And the central executive is sort of in the control seat here, making both of these work. He recognized kind of later on that probably needed to say to have the central executive have a memory system itself. So he put in this thing called the episodic buffer, which you didn't need to worry about. But generally, it's just a way for the central executive to remember things. Right? You don't want to grant it too much, right? So you want it to actually have a memory system that has capacity and limitations. So that's the flow. I'm not sure it's really quite rich enough to handle all the things that you do. But this is how people are conceiving of this idea of working memory, and it really has completely replaced and supplanted the usual short-term memory stuff that was popular way back in the day. All right, so I realize that's a little bit dry. Memory's a little bit dry generally, I'm afraid. Questions on any of this?
You know what was the right penny?
What's that?
You know what was the right penny?
Oh, I was afraid somebody was gonna ask me that. All right, so which one is the correct penny? I want to say that A faces, that way, right? Is that everybody's intuition? Right, right, does anybody have a penny on them? Nobody even has a penny. I don't know.
It's very-
No, I should know. So I think this is right. I think Liberty is on there. Somebody look up a picture of a penny. That's a yes, right? We have our phones. So you're connected to the knowledge of pennies. No, I don't like this. I don't like the mark there. There probably is a mark somewhere.
I think it's A.
You think it's A?
Yeah.
That seems too easy. Would you put it in A? If you make this, I wouldn't put it in A. Used to know. Is it A? It's A? I think it's E. What's it say on the, this looks like, I don't know what that is.
Has to have Liberty.
It has to have Liberty. It's no better here. Yeah. Does it have "In God We Trust" on the top?
Yeah.
It does have that. Yeah. Funny how hard it is, right? How many pennies have I touched in my life? The bazillion, right? All right. That won't be on the exam. All right, so let's do something a little bit more fun. So I realize that's kind of dry. So we talked about, or at least I mentioned that there are top-down processes in memory. And it turns out that one of the big thrusts in psychology over the last 30, 40 years has been the idea that rather than memory being about taking bits and remembering bits, maybe more about integrating what's coming in to what you know. So what you know then has this tremendous effect on what it is that you're able to remember. Right? So another way to think about it is that the ability of you to kind of organize what's coming in into your current knowledge structure tremendously affects how memory would work. And we call these top-down processes. One of the early names, which I've never particularly cared for, but anyway, it hung on. They used for this was schemas. So schemas are supposed to be kind of organizational units for memories, right? So they're almost like scripts or something. So classic examples are going into a restaurant. You have a schema for what you expect to happen. And of course, the people working there have a schema for what they expect to happen. So usually you go in and there's a place you're supposed to stand. And then you try to determine like what the seating policy is. Do I wait to be seated? It's kind of typical. But there's also a possibility that you don't wait to be seated and you just go ahead and sit down. And there's a third possibility, of course, which is that it's an order at the counter place, which you may not detect. So you can go into Dog Lane and watch people have this experience. Go into Dog Lane and people are like, what is supposed to be happening here? So it's not exactly clear that it's a counter ordering place. And then there are two counters, which is kind of strange. But great, so you kind of go, okay, so people will stand there for a while at that little juncture point and go, do I go right? Do I go left? Do I sit down? It's not clear, right? So, and in foreign countries, of course, there are also little differences, right? So if you go to France or to Italy, first of all, dinner doesn't start until like 9 o'clock. Second of all, you're expected to stay at the table and be there until they close. So you go in at 9, you have dinner, and if you're from, at least for me, I'm actually pretty quick. I'm done in an hour, and then I want to get up and I want to go on to my next thing. But they're expecting you to occupy the table, so you're like, hello, yeah, check, right? So there's no, they're not coming back to you as they do here, right? So it's a difference in their schema, right? So that sort of thing, are differences in schemas, right, which reveal a little bit about schemas to us. So schemas, again, help you organize your experiences, but they also help you remember things, and that's
Most of the factors that
with these,
predict
whoops, sorry,
whether or not-
you too. So these guys are a little bit humorous, and they're going to tell us, they give us an example of schema and memory organization. And I think it's mostly self-explanatory, but you'll see they have at the end, they have a list of things to do that they're going to organize by schemas kind of retrospectively for you. So it's, here we go.
Most of the factors that predict whether or not something that is being perceived will also be remembered operate in the first few seconds of learning. One of these factors involves something termed a schema and whether or not the new learning bumps into one. Let me show you an example of a schema by having Dr. Whitehead and myself read a paragraph to you, one actually taken from a famous research paper. Your job is to remember as many facts about the paragraph as you can. Let me tell you in advance that you are going to fail miserably at this task unless I do something first. I can instantly improve your memory score from between 50 to 100% simply by adding 7 little words before you hear Dr. Whitehead and myself. But I'm not going to do that. You will hear the paragraph first, then I will read you the words.
The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient, depending on how much there is to do.
If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many.
In the short term, this might not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well.
After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places.
Eventually, they'll be used once more in the whole cycle that have to be repeated. However, that is a part of life.
Did you get all that? No? Let us give you now the 7 magic little words. This paragraph is all about washing clothes. What that sentence provides for you is a mental framework, a way of organizing thoughts around some aspect of the world. We call such frameworks schemas, and you have them about people,
They're not gonna stop.
situations, objects.
They're so entertaining.
Which means some.
All right, so it's entertaining. I think mostly it's his accent that's entertaining. Shit, a Scottish accent. But you get the idea, and this is typical of what especially early stuff was like. So by giving you a schema, in this case, these sentences will be about washing clothes, please remember them, versus these sentences, please remember them, right? You get really good performance when you know what it's about. And even like at the word-to-word level. You don't know what it's about, performance is miserable, right? Because it's like, what? They gotta put it in piles. Go through cycle again, cycle again. What are you talking about? So the lack of meaningfulness without the schema makes memory poor, right? Which is odd if you think memory is just a bottom-up process, right? Because they're the same sentences. Why would knowing what their meaning is ultimately about, why would that help? Right? It's difficult to explain. So that's a typical example of schemas. So one way to talk about them formally is talk about them as organized knowledge structures. They help you make predictions about the environment. So when we encounter a novel situation, the idea is that you try to match it to the schemas that you have in memory so that you can figure out what you're doing and what goes next, but also you can then remember them. So obviously, as we've already said, so individuals are able to recall more if they already can establish appropriate context. All right, that is it. Thanks for your kind attention.